and maybe take some questions on what you might have about the bill in particular. But I will say this. I'm real concerned about the approach that was taken with health care, because rather than focus on lowering the costs of health care rising premiums among individuals, small businesses, and families, this bill primarily focuses on an expansion of access, and it does it through large subsidies. And some of the ramifications of tax policies, et cetera, as that gets phased in now over the next couple of years, is going to have an effect on the rest of the broader economy. And so I know we've expanded access, but it's very expensive to do it in the way it's doing here now, because it's relying on Medicaid and medical assistance and Medicare, which is already going to go bankrupt in 7.5 years. And so we're pushing further down on having a government expansion of those programs, as opposed to really allowing, I think where the bread and butter is in terms of having small businesses pool together to offer insurance, or having tort reform be a component of the legislation ultimately, which I think is needed to lower health care costs in defensive medicine. And there are many providers I still talk to that want to make sure that they can reimbursed for the services they do, not because they get mandated by the federal government to do so, to get paid, but they want to do what's best for the patient. And there are many physicians I've met with that say the only way I will get reimbursed as a physician under federal statute or guidelines is if I do a certain procedure on a patient, and that patient doesn't even need that procedure. So there are absolutely things that can be and should be done to lower costs, and I think that's where the focus needs to be. And even with this bill passing, I'm not going to stop working on helping on the cost containment side of it, which I think needs to be the ultimate focus for the bill. Energy legislation, we handed out a quick piece that I'm working on nuclear energy development with Tim Walz, and this should be bipartisan. The President's made some good comments recently about providing additional loan guarantees to states. I think it's Georgia where there's development of nuclear energy options down the road. We are way behind the curve on this one, and this is not something you can turn around on a dime and in 2 years have a nuclear power plant. But the technologies have changed in a way that we have an opportunity to provide more base load energy, which we really need to do. I'm all for renewable energy and wind and solar and those sorts of things. That's really key to do, but you need the base load energy to back it up. And it's really difficult right now to permit a brand new, whether it's a coal fire plant or whatever, natural gas even, it's really difficult to get the permits put forward to actually expand your base load power operations. And we should be looking at clean, new energy opportunities like nuclear energy. And so thankfully, bipartisanly, I've been working with some folks to actually make some progress on this, and I hope the President's going to continue to talk about this, because ultimately it means we're going to be less dependent on foreign oil, for instance. That's key to our national security as well. So it kind of covers the spectrum from a national security standpoint all the way down to a cost perspective to what the business community thinks is important. And I'm just going to close with this and take your questions, because as I said, bubbles are created when the values exceed reasonable, substantial basis. And we have to get back to some real basics, I think, in the country. And spending has been crazy. It really has. And I know it's difficult sometimes for legislators or members of Congress to say no. The President, in his State of the Union speech, talked about the need of having sustainable budgets down the road, because even his own administration says the budget deficits are unsustainable. That's really key. And so we got to get back to the basics. You can't have double-digit increases when the revenues are not coming in at double-digit levels. I mean, the math doesn't work. And everything, including government revenues, depends on job creation. And the federal government never has been or never will be a permanent job creator. That's not what it's going to do. It can create the environment to make things better. That ultimately is going to depend on people like you. And whatever I can do to help as a part of that effort. If you want to be a part of my Small Business Advisory Committee, just leave me a card, or Dan or Luke a card, and we'll get you on that list too. And informally, we meet periodically. I get great ideas out of it. I get great anecdotes and great stories, because I can go back and tell my colleagues, this is what this really means in the real world. I talked to one small business owner, for instance, who talked about the new mandate of health insurance. He's got 56 employees. He says, the way I'm reading this bill right now, if I go below 50 employees, I'm not going to get fined the $2,000 coverage for a mandate. It makes more sense for me to lay off 6 people. Now, what kind of message are we sending the business community and our job creators if that's the type of legislation we're passing? That's fundamentally wrong. And so that's where the challenge is right now, and I hope that you stay involved, either whether it's informally advising me, or you stay active with the Chamber. And I couldn't do it without your help and support. I use you as a resource. I don't have all the answers, because I don't think there's Republican answers and Democrat answers to many of these issues, but I do know that if I listen and if we work together, we can get some good things accomplished. So thanks for all you do as the Chamber, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have this morning.
Thank you very much. I think what we're going to do, if you have questions that you've written out, raise your hand, and Judy will come by and grab them, and I've got a couple to start us out. I feel really awkward with the sign, so if you don't mind, I could just stay behind the sign. You know, you talked a lot, Congressman, about the fiscal challenges that this country has, and actually just yesterday, the head of the Congressional Budget Office again declared that our fiscal path is unsustainable. And actually, one quote that came out of that, which was just shocking to me, which kind of just expands a little bit what you talked about, was that by the end of 2020, our deficit will be $20.3 trillion. I mean, that becomes even unimaginable. And so Ben Bernanke this week earlier said that this country either needs to cut entitlement programs or raise taxes. I think you know what our preference would be, but to do that and do that immediately. And so my question, though, with the partisan nature right now that it appears from the outsider looking into Congress, will anything get done this Congress?
Well, unfortunately, it sounds like, from what I understand from the leadership, and we are supposed to, when we return in April after the Easter recess, start beginning to have the discussion about the budget. And I've been hearing some rumblings that because the numbers are so dramatic or drastic, as you just mentioned, that the Speaker may give the word out to her leadership. They may not pass a budget this year. They may not want to renew a budget. They may just want to do a concurrent resolution process where they're just going to sort of continue existing levels all the way through the election. Because quite honestly, I think they're very concerned about people paying attention, knowing that this is not sustainable. And so I'm not convinced that the leadership that exists in Congress right now is willing to tackle this problem or have that discussion. And when the President had his mention of the need to focus on deficits as a part of his State of the Union speech recently, he said we need to do it, but we can wait another year, and I'm only going to apply it, I think, to what, 13% of the budget, you know, for freezing some accounts. You know, we need to have the discussion now. When the debt ceiling was raised another $2 trillion, that was the time to say, look, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless we tackle some of these issues by doing X, Y, and Z. And sometimes these are not going to be real easy solutions to talk about. But you got to have the conversation and you got to get it on the table. And I think there's some new leaders that are rising up that are willing to have these discussions. And quite honestly, as a freshman member, I will tell you there are freshmen on both sides of the aisle that are willing to have these conversations. And we speak the same language on a lot of these issues. But the challenge is to get many of these members to break away from their leaders in saying, you know, we're not going to just get out of this in 2 years or 4 years because that's the way it's always been done. And that's, I think, where the hope and the optimism is for the future.
To that point, then, so this Congress is scheduled right now, and obviously this is a number that can move, but to end around October 15th. I think there's some elections or something coming up in November that people might want to get home for. So that's about 6 months between now and then. There's some additional breaks in that. What do you think Congress will do between now and October 15th? What issues do you think will still get addressed?
I think one of the key issues that will get addressed when we return is going to be some sort of regulations on the financial service industry, and that's in the wake of the meltdown that occurred just a year and a half ago and the TARP bailouts. I mean, I have been doing whatever I can to focus and end on the too big to fail mentality that exists and the end of the bailout, the taxpayer bailout implicit guarantees. I'm concerned that some of the bailout provisions are still contained now in some of the regulatory reforms being brought forward. In other words, there are going to be either new taxes on banks, whether you had a part in the financial meltdown or not, as well as other nonprofits. It's very ill-defined, and there's going to be a collection of money to have sort of a pool of systemic risk pool to back up some of these companies if they fail again. And if they don't, well, then taxpayers will come in and fill the hole. I think that's wrong, and I think that's how you're going to encourage more risk. You encourage more moral hazard unless you're going to move in a different direction. I think you're going to see this on the front page of the paper probably in the month of May because the Senate, the House has already passed a financial services reform bill, some of it with some controversy. The Senate is now going to take action next, and the administration is going to push very hard to do something on that issue. So that'll be a key focus. The other issue I think that you might get some focus on is likely going to be around the budget again and tax rates and tax levels. There's going to be somewhat of a conversation about that, but also potentially some of the energy legislation coming back and cap and trade energy legislation, which is going to increase costs on the production of goods and services for the business community. That's going to be brought back potentially at some point. That's very controversial as well.